Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome to Big Blend Radio, everyone. Today we're honored to have Leah Rothstein join us. Her and her dad, Richard, wrote the book Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. It's out now, but the paperback edition is coming out March 4th, 2025. Go to their website, justactionbook.org. There's a lot of activity on Substack, a lot of resources there, and just good to have you on the show, Leah. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So what's it like working with your dad on a book?
It was surprisingly successful and easeful. You never know
Yeah.
embarking on a project like that with a parent. But it went
Yeah.
really well. He has all this historical knowledge and journalism experience. I have housing policy knowledge and experience. So bringing that together worked out really well. And a big gift for me of the process was just seeing up close firsthand the impact he's had with his work, his
Yeah.
previous book, The Color of Law.
Yeah, that's massive.
That has been really, really special.
Well, I love this because this is really about taking action, and what people can do. And, I know that, during the era of Black Lives Matter, there are people wearing signs and there's walking, there's marches. And we even look at this when you look at the environment and climate change, right? Which is affecting everyone too, and when I look at what's happening in neighborhoods, those who are in the minority world, they don't get trees, they don't, and it affects health. I mean, there's just this huge, I didn't realize that we had American Forest on the show a few years ago talking about tree equity and how, like, I was like, whoa, I didn't know this, yes, us rich people get to have trees and nobody else, so,
That's
but it,
right.
and that it was, segregation as well.
Mhm.
So what I like about this is that it's actual action pieces that people can do within their communities to change things. And it's pretty complex. There's all kinds of things from banking to land trust to, what would be the first thing you'd say for a community looking at, hey, we need to be able to have affordable housing?
Well, the first thing that we talk about is just getting together with your neighbors, building groups, coalitions, committees that can talk about these issues. And those groups should contain people of different races from different parts of your
Hmm.
city. We have to get out of our segregated bubbles to get to know each other and understand what life is like in other neighborhoods and what the barriers are to sort of spreading around resources in our communities. And so first getting together, you know, uh, breaking down the barriers and obstacles that exist between segregated neighborhoods to just start to build relationships. And then from that, learning about the history of our own communities and how we came to be segregated, why our cities look the way they do, why neighborhoods look differently, why some neighborhoods have more trees than others, and some have more bank branches than others, and some have,
Mm.
more polluted air than others, and start to unpack that history. Because what we argue, what we think is very important and is kind of clear from the progression of the books, my dad first wrote The Color of Law, which is a comprehensive history of how government policy created segregation. And we think it's important to understand that history so that we can
Hmm.
understand that we have an obligation to do something about it, because the way the government created segregation was in violation of the Constitution. And when that happens, we have an obligation to remedy those violations. And
Hmm.
also to understand that if this happened intentionally, through government action, it can be challenged and undone intentionally through government action. So it gives us a path forward.
Yeah, and especially right now, man, laws are getting flipped upside down all over the place. It's like crazy land out there, and you're like, who, what, and where? Whoa, So I think it is important to have like your roots connected. You know what I mean? Like literally everyone in a community and go from that perspective at times, because it is getting complex out there. And housing, am I right in this? Because people always talk about the Housing Act and things like that. It seems like housing is tied to so many other things that really affect quality of life, right? And so, yeah, I mean, what I was looking at is, people will come. I think because we travel full time, and what we're seeing from traveling and
Mhm.
hearing locally in news is that like somebody will come in and decide, oh, we're doing this to a neighborhood. We're buying out all these houses and then we're going to raise the rates. And it seems like affordable housing is out the window no matter who you are, right? And
Mhm.
so if you're a person of color, then you're really going to get it, right? So it just seems that these companies are getting together and just buying out regions. Have you seen that part happen?
Yes, that's definitely happening. It, was exacerbated in the foreclosure crisis when a lot of homes were foreclosed upon and then were left vacant. And so large corporations were just buying up huge amounts of homes, and they're continuing to do that. And so what they call the starter home, which is, a smaller, more naturally affordable home ownership opportunity,
Mm,
which is how often families get into home ownership for the first time. Many of the starter home stock in the country in all kinds of communities are being bought up by corporations and investors who then jack up, they rent them out. So they're no longer, helping families get into home ownership, and the rents are often higher than they would otherwise be or were before. And they don't maintain the homes up to habitable standards, but there's no person in charge of the corporation that those
mm-hmm.
renters can complain to. So it's a big issue that cities are
Ooh.
having to tackle. And they're coming up with some innovative ways to try to regulate that and bring that into control. And it's an issue that's affecting affordable housing everywhere. There's a lot of pieces in the housing puzzle that have gotten us to where we are today, not just in our neighborhoods being racially segregated, but in this lack of housing that's affordable to middle income working families.
Mm. I've heard really some horror stories of people thinking that, oh, they're going to take over the mortgage, but let me live here, that kind of thing. Some real horror stories, and it's not anything that what they thought was going to happen. Um, and
Yeah,
they
that's
lose
like,
all their equity.
yeah, buying homes on contract is what it has been called. Sometimes it's called lease to own, rent to own. Sometimes those programs are good for the residents of the homes because it helps them get into home ownership if they're run by, public agencies, nonprofit organizations with a public mission. But often they're contracts that are held by investors or speculators or corporations and made to look like a mortgage. So the
Hmm.
person who thinks they're a homeowner are paying towards a mortgage, but it's really a contract that doesn't have any of the protections that a mortgage has. So in a mortgage, if you pay towards, you pay every month, some of that goes to the principal, some of it goes to the interest. If you then sell the home, even default on the mortgage, there's some equity that you've built in the home by paying
Yeah.
towards the principal that whole time. And a contract, you don't build any equity until you make the last payment on the contract. So until that contract is
Oh.
complete, the investor owns the home and you're basically renting it. And they can, what they've done, and we wrote about this in Just Action because it was a common
Mhm.
practice in the mid 20th century in places like Chicago, Baltimore. A lot of African American communities were exploited through this contract sale process because they didn't have access to mortgages through the banking, traditional banking institution.
Right.
And so they had to rely on these contracts. And what would happen, speculators would buy the home, sell them on contract. The home, quote unquote, homeowners would pay towards their contract for years. And if they missed a payment or were late on a payment, or the investor would increase interest rates for no reason,
Hmm.
and if they couldn't keep up, they would consider it a default and they would lose everything that they've paid towards the contract. They'd lose the home. They, would lose all the money they put into maintenance and repairing the home, had built no
Wow.
equity, and then the investor would reclaim the home, jack up the
And
price,
start
and,
all
and
over.
start all over. Yeah, and so we're seeing that
Wow.
happening again.
Yeah. And one thing you're talking about the banking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's also that movement, right, where you can, I mean, going against banks. That's why, the Dakota Access Pipeline was a big drama because you're talking about someone's territorial land in a way, where there's that. And when we went and looked at what was going on, it was basically all these shell corporations with people like Shell Oil and, and all these banks. I mean, just about every single major bank was part of this, right? And it was kind of crazy. And we thought, let's call oil lawyers for the show. That didn't help. We anyway. Um, the banking side of things can be absolutely impossible for people. And then African Americans, what I'm seeing is there really is there a movement to within a community try and get a African American bank. And so a lot of people think that's, well, why do we need to do that? That's segregation in itself. But historically, haven't the banks been kind of not workable?
Yeah, sure. The banks have, like realtors, like insurance companies, like developers have been strong players in creating segregation and maintaining segregation. Now there is a movement to create Black-owned banks in Black communities. Um, but what another sort of aspect of this is that now banks are required to adhere to what's called the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires that banks, it was enacted to counter the redlining practices of banks, where banks would not do business with African Americans or in communities of color. So the Community Reinvestment Act requires banks to equitably invest in all of the neighborhoods in their service area. So if this bank says it serves this city, they can't only have bank branches in the white neighborhoods and give loans to white homeowners and to white business owners, small business owners. They have to also invest and have bank branches and give loans in the lower income neighborhoods within that service area.
Mhm.
And every bank is rated on how well they adhere to the Community Reinvestment Act requirements. They get a score. Now, the scoring system needs improvement. Most banks pass, even though they're not doing very well at this. But there is, in this Community Reinvestment Act process, there is a role for community activists and advocates. And that is when banks want to merge with another bank or acquire another bank, which happens far more often than you could ever
Yeah.
imagine. When they want to do that, they need federal regulatory approval. And those federal regulators, they look at their Community Reinvestment Act score and decide if they should approve this merger or acquisition. They also have to hear public comment. So this is when public, locally formed advocacy organizations come out and say, look, this bank has not been living up to its CRA promises. It doesn't give any loans or mortgages to our communities, or there's no bank branches. They come with evidence, and they can, start public relations
Hmm.
campaigns against the banks, which banks really
Oh,
don't like that.
no.
And so in that process, because banks want something from federal regulatory agencies, they want approval for the merger, and community groups can hold up that approval. And this is where there is a point of power for communities. And often, groups organize around this and they hold up a merger acquisition until a bank agrees to do better on serving these communities. And they often come up with settlements where they agree to a certain amount of mortgage
Mm.
lending to lower income communities, to open a certain number of branches, to invest in affordable housing, small business lending. And that's the best leverage communities have to force banks to live up to the obligations that they have under law.
Well, for small business funding, it's been almost impossible too.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. I know that even a small business, if you didn't have a brick and mortar store, that was impossible. It's like they didn't understand that. Now we're slowly getting there, but it's still a big pain in the butt. It
Mhm.
is.
Yeah.
Um, you know, be travelers like we are. That's always fun. So,
Right.
I was gonna also ask about land trusts. Tell us about that role of what goes into a land trust, why they're important, and how communities can get involved in that.
Yeah, land trusts are fabulous. They're called community land trusts. They came out of the civil rights movement. They're nonprofit organizations. There's over 300 communities around the country that have a land trust. They're growing rapidly right now because it's a
Hmm.
great tool in our toolbox to respond to the affordable housing crisis. So how land trusts work is they establish or they acquire property.
Hmm.
Often, sometimes they buy it if they have some funding, or they get donated land or foreclosed houses from local government. So this is, again, another place local residents have a point of power. They can pressure their local government to donate land to a land trust. Every local government is sitting on some vacant land, either
Hmm.
unused public properties or foreclosed homes or land banked properties, and they could donate some of that to a land trust. And the land trust fixes up or builds homes on those properties and sells them at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. And those
Mm,
prices are affordable because in the transaction, the land trust just sells the home and retains ownership of the land underneath the home.
okay.
And one of the major drivers of the rising cost of housing is the rising cost of land. So if you take the
Hmm.
land out of the equation, the house is more naturally
Hmm.
affordable. And then the
Huh.
homeowner, they own their home like any other homeowner. They pay their mortgage, taxes, insurance. They don't pay taxes on the land, just on the home. And then
Hmm.
when they want to resell the home, they adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust establishes.
Okay.
And that's to ensure that that maximum resale price, every land trust sort of establishes it in a different way with a different formula. It allows the price to rise somewhat from what that original homeowner paid for it, but not so much that it's all the way up at market value where it's unaffordable to the next home buyer. So they want to
Mm.
balance the desire for the home seller to build up some equity, but for the price to remain affordable to the next home buyer. So it's called a
Okay.
limited equity arrangement. And in that formula and in that model, those homes are permanently affordable, which in any other model is impossible to achieve permanent affordability for home ownership
Mm.
without putting subsidies into it at every resale. So this is a way to accomplish that. And it's a way to preserve affordable homes in communities where housing prices are rising really rapidly.
Mm.
That's why it's such a great model right now where, housing
That
is
is good.
everywhere.
And it protects the land too. That leads me to the tourism factor. We do tons on tourism, and tourism, when done correctly, can really help a health of a community.
Mm,
If the community is part of the tourism plan. If the community is ignored, well, then it sucks for everyone. And everybody gets upset. Everybody's worried, like, oh, is my little pretty town in nature that's historic going to be Disneyland? And if you've got to
mm,
have the community voice be part of
mm,
it. But
mhm.
what we've also seen is that people looked at dollar signs and allowed people to come in and buy second and third homes to use them for Airbnbs and vacation rentals and things like that, which made it impossible for families to keep up, and families that may have lived there for generations
Yeah.
be able to afford it and have the kind of maybe the work that they do. And actually, the Airbnbs, I've seen entire communities not be able to even have housekeeping staff because the housekeepers can't afford to live where they were anymore and have to drive in for 2 hours to get to work and back is not going to happen. So I've seen a lot of that happen across the country. And to
Yeah.
me, that is a form of segregation, whether no matter what color you are, and and I've seen it for women too, single women, especially
Mm.
single moms go through this kind of thing too.
Yeah, it's another way of taking affordable housing or just housing off of the market. And the less supply you have, as demand rises, prices just go up. So, that's
Mm,
how, why, one of the reasons why prices are continuing to rise,
mm,
especially in high cost neighborhoods.
mm,
And so some communities are taking actions around this, limiting what can be done with Airbnb, how many days per month a home can be rented on a, Airbnb type basis to try to limit some of that impact on the housing
yeah.
stock. Another thing that has a sort of a similar impact is zoning,
Oh
which
yeah, I was
we
thinking
write
that.
about.
Yeah.
So zoning is, zoning codes are adopted by local government. They say what kind of buildings can be built where. So in commercial zones, you can have commercial buildings. In industrial zones, you can have industrial buildings. In residential zones, you can have homes and apartments. And then they separate out what kinds of residences can be in what kinds of neighborhoods. High cost areas, most suburbs, actually most of the country's residentially zoned land is zoned only to allow one house per lot. It's called single
Mm,
family only zoning. This ensures and has led to the affordable housing crisis we're in because as demand increases, you can't build more homes in those communities. You can still only have one home per lot. So the supply is limited. It ensures that those neighborhoods stay unaffordable and has been a primary way of maintaining racial segregation because very expensive homes are more likely to be able to be afforded by or paid
yeah.
for by white families who have
Mm,
intergenerational wealth because of past government policies that help them
wow.
build that through home ownership. So, zoning again in communities, just like the housekeepers in areas with high rates of
Yeah,
Airbnb homes, homes in single family only zoned suburbs are so expensive that teachers can't afford to live in those communities, or police
right.
officers, firefighters, public service, first
Yeah.
responders. And not to mention, anyone of other races that have, been able to access those neighborhoods. So first step for a lot of this that we're talking about is to reform zoning in those
Mm,
areas. And a lot of areas, cities and states are taking this on as they've become, they've accepted that this is the first step needed to address the affordable housing crisis,
mm,
is to allow more homes to be built in all neighborhoods. So instead of
yeah.
single family home on one lot, allow a duplex or a triplex, or
Mm.
allow an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, that, like a granny flat, to be built on the same property, just to increase density some, so we can increase the housing supply and bring down, or can
And there's
constrain
so many
prices.
empty places that are being turned
Yeah,
into things like empty strip malls are being turned into, lodging, empty hotels, things like that.
yeah,
And actually, the federal government has a lot of empty buildings. They do.
yes,
And
yep.
they could, turn that around. So it's like you don't even have to build from scratch. You can use some of the things that are there. To me, that it's important that people have a voice and go to these city hall meetings. So many of us like, I don't want to go see a bunch of, government people in suits talking, but I think it's really important. We lived in a community that just kind of let things go. And one
Mm,
day we had a fire, and the military was the only people that could come out because we suddenly
wow.
didn't have a police station. We suddenly didn't have a fire station. All
Mm,
those kinds of things happened without having the right, because you can knock on their door. That is important. And when you're talking about, just action, I love that term too. Everyone getting together, and you can be more than one voice, and together more powerful. I was wondering about the impacts of voter legislation on housing, because of a lot of people weren't able to vote for very many years.
mm.
So has that affected housing quality when it comes to speaking to government and being, allowed to vote?
Well, sure. All of these, a lot of these policies historically were first adopted by the federal government. Segregation was first created by policies of
Hmm.
the federal government. But once it was initially established, then to a large extent, segregation is maintained by local policies and local government. So if you have a community where only white people can vote, or, do vote, the people who are voted to represent them in the city council or county, board of supervisors, the planning commissions, all of those representatives are not representing the full range of residents of that community. So they're supporting policies that maintain that segregation and benefit only those communities that, are voting for them. And so, um, now we're all have the right to vote, but we still don't all turn out to vote or come out to our city council meetings. And it's true, it's maybe not the most fun thing to do, go to a city council meeting on a Tuesday night.
Hmm.
But, I think that, as I was talking about in the beginning, once we get together with neighbors and start to learn about how this impacts us, I think can start to see how important it is. I think a lot of people think that housing policy is not that interesting, maybe doesn't affect them. I have a place to live, my neighborhood's fine, I don't need to worry about this. And then at some point, you start to learn, no, this actually does impact me and my quality of life and my community's health. When houses become too expensive for the teachers to live there, and your kids' teachers, leave every year, half of them leave the school every year, and there's no consistency or stability, or you can't, get a fire department to show up because they can't afford to keep,
Yeah.
firefighters. It does impact us. And so we have to then start to think, well, if it impacts me, what am I going to do about it? And it
Mm.
maybe changes how you vote, how you think about your elected officials, maybe what kinds of actions you take locally, how you talk to your neighbors, even,
Hmm.
as if there's a housing development proposed in your neighborhood and you hear neighbors saying like, oh, we don't want those kinds of people here, maybe you have a different response to that now.
Well, also it affects schooling
Yeah.
because, I think everything to do with housing affects schools. and education. Those two, like when we talk about it being complex, it really is. And,
Hmm.
if you get to a point where, hey, you're going to have, housing for everyone, you need to have education be and parks for quality of health. Honestly,
Yeah.
they say you need a park within 8 minutes of your house, 8 to 10 minutes
Mm.
for optimal health of a community.
Mm.
And who can afford healthcare? That's a whole other deal. So
Yeah.
prevention is part of an investment that should be for everyone and not segregated. And so I think the school thing, that's important to rally around, and sometimes can get people from all sides together looking at how schools work
Yeah.
in their community.
Yeah. Very true.
That's a
Yes.
shared thing.
School segregation and neighborhood segregation go hand in hand.
Schools, neighborhoods, you name it. So
Mhm.
everyone's got to have a voice. I love that you've got a detailed plan in here for everyone. Last thing I wanted to ask was about renters' rights,
Mm.
because I see that, there's still slumlords. I have a good friend who's a single mom, went through medical hell, and the landlord won't go and fix what he said, and then wants the money, and she has nowhere to go because there isn't affordable housing in her area without pulling kids out of schools and even moving. And some people don't have the money to move.
Right. Or nowhere to move to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, protecting renters, particularly in areas where, what we write about in Just Action, we focus
Hmm.
very much on segregation and what we can do to remedy it. And so one of the remedies for segregation is to increase resources in lower income segregated, predominantly African American communities, that have been deprived of resources through the same government policies that created
Hmm.
segregation. Now you improve resources in those communities, housing prices rise because people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in living there. And so then it becomes an issue of protecting the renters in those communities from being displaced, because if we're going to improve resources in a historically under-resourced community, we don't want then to displace all the residents who've lived there forever right when it's
Right.
starting to see increased investment. So to prevent some of that displacement, we need renter protection policies, rent regulation to protect renters from rapidly increasing rents. These are locally adopted ordinances that put a cap on how much rent can rise every year. Just cause eviction ordinances. So those protect renters from unjust evictions. It gives landlords certain reasons they can evict a tenant, and outside of that, they can't. So failure to pay rent, violation of the lease agreement, kind of standard eviction reasons, but a landlord can't just say, oh, you're out of here because now I can get a higher paying tenant in.
Mm.
And then for the example you gave, some communities have adopted right to counsel programs, which provide free representation to lower income tenants who are facing evictions. Oftentimes, tenants like the one you described face an eviction because they withhold paying rent and because their landlord isn't maintaining the
Right.
unit, and that's the only power they have, is to not pay rent if it's not being kept up to standards. And then if they don't pay rent, they're served an eviction notice. So in communities with the right to counsel program, those tenants have a free right to representation to an attorney in the eviction proceedings. And those attorneys, have very high success rates, over almost 90% or higher in most communities that have these, of keeping tenants in their homes, keeping an eviction order from being on those tenants' permanent rental records, forcing landlords to keep up the home or provide the needed
Hmm.
maintenance, and helping tenants, if they need it, access some public benefits or relief if they've missed rent because they maybe were laid off or couldn't pay rent for a little while. So that,
Yeah.
again, locally adopted right to counsel programs. Usually the city government will pass a right to counsel program. Sometimes some counties have, they fund it to sometimes through general fund or philanthropic funds to go towards a legal aid society or a other legal group that can help provide representation for those tenants.
I think you're so right about having these resources, because even medical resource, and you look at what happened with the fentanyl situation we have, that affects people being able to pay. And I mean, there's this just it's massive,
Yeah.
for people. So it's those community resources are key. So I love that you have everybody get the book, Just Action, because all of this is in there for people to use as a total resource which can change everything together and unite communities, to
Yeah.
have more diversification and people understand each other's cultures. And like you said, the history, I think, is totally important because from what I see, I think that all of this, if you don't have this action part, that's where we have the increase in people experiencing homelessness. And we
Mhm.
see that if you give people an opportunity to, get health care, get clothes back on their back, have a place to live, that they can start getting towards jobs and things like that. So I think this is a huge thing for people to be able to use to take action. I love
Yeah.
it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I hope it is.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for doing this, and thank your dad too, Richard,
I
for
will. I will.
his history and everything he's doing. Because the other thing that I think is so fantastic about this book is it has answers. Because people argue about this stuff, and there's all kinds of stuff on social media. There's headlines, and people say, oh well, this, whatever, what I'm talking about. This gives people answers that are historically accurate to be able to say, no, this is why this happened, and this is how, and this is why. And so that it's a not necessarily an emotional reaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it breaks it down. What I hope is the book breaks down what seem to be too complicated for regular people to understand, these housing policies that affect us, breaks it down to give us really actionable steps of what we can do in our own communities and how we can work together to make things better, which I
Yeah.
think we all need some hope right now. And that I hope that
Absolutely.
provides some of that.
Well, my favorite quote, I always say this on shows, is from Joan Baez, is action is the antidote to despair. So as soon
Yeah.
as I saw your book, I'm like, dude, gosh, come on the show,
Yeah.
because that it makes you feel better, especially with you're working with people that are understanding and you don't feel so alone. And that's
Mhm.
where things get really dark for people,
Yeah.
and so if you rise up together, things can change and be positive and not so stressful. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's
yeah.
true.
I like that. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, we're going to go to the website, go to justactionbook.org and check it out there. And then also go to the Just Action Substack column and get involved there, because that's a lot of resources as well. So thank you so much, Leah. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.